Welcome to the first podcast series here at The Coping Mechanism. In this series, we explore the findings of our first survey, which asked people how they are coping during the pandemic. In each episode, we are joined by experts who give us a deeper understanding of these findings, as well as an evaluation of what we might expect in the near future. I'm Malika Speaks, poet and spoken word artist. I have been hosting these discussions and I'll be giving you my thoughts and conclusions at the end of the video. Our results showed low levels of trust in government. Almost half of our respondents said that they believe the spread of COVID-19 was due to government negligence. Qualitative comments included blame shifting, which we identified as throwing the hot potato, as well as references to the actions of Dominic Cummings. We also look at government slogans and the responsibility that they place on the public, as well as how this affects individuals. So we know that there are these hot potatoes, but the question is, how do we cool down the oven? In this episode, Anita Nayyar, director at The Coping Mechanism, presents our findings, and she is joined by Myira, counsellor and psychotherapist. Our findings showed high levels of distrust between people and government. For example, we had almost half of our respondents saying that they believed that the spread of the coronavirus was due to government negligence. And we had another significant statistic, which was that 12% of people said that they believed that the pandemic wasn't an accident, but actually something that was planned. And again, this is showing high levels of distrust. Some examples of the things that our respondents were saying was, making reference to government's poor leadership and terrible decision making. We even had one of the respondents saying that they were following the lead of other governments in other countries because, as they quoted, were watching Boris blunder his way through dealing with the pandemic. We also had references to the actions of Dominic Cummings, with one of our respondents saying how they felt it was outrageous to see how the government is responding to the pandemic while flouting the rules. And what we see through these beliefs and these perspectives is that people are actually passing on blame. And Myira, I know that you've identified this before and referred to it as the hot potato. So what people are doing is kind of chucking this blame at other people and other communities. We even have had some of our respondents say that the spread of the virus is because of other minorities and other groups of people. I'm just wondering, Anita, could you explain a little bit more about the types of communication that we've had from the government and how this has affected people?
Yeah, so I think, you touched on something really interesting there, which is that we saw what people were really talking about was government are telling us what to do whilst not taking responsibility. That's what people were perceiving. And that hot potato that I'm looking forward to Myira talking about is, it's sort of like, I'm receiving a responsibility that's not mine, so I'm going to pass that on to someone else because I don't know what to do with it. So just looking at this from like a communication psychology perspective, I remember when the first slogan came about, stay at home, save lives, protect the NHS. So we all remember that. And I remember at that time saying to my husband, I'm a bit worried about what this slogan is doing, because it seems to be passing on a responsibility that's not ours, and it seems to be using a type of communication psychology that's not really appropriate for now. So I'll just say a bit about that first slogan and how that sort of, then I see the results as directly kind of reflecting what's been passed on to people. So the government seems to start off by using nudge tactics, what we call nudge tactics. So nudge tactics rely, first of all, on normal life. They almost exploit some mental shortcuts that our minds do, and they tend to be used a lot in marketing. So Ryanair love the nudge tactics. Famously Ryanair, when you're buying an airline ticket, you have to uncheck the extra options rather than check them, because we just want to get to the end and buy our ticket, don't we? So they kind of exploit that mental shortcut that we just try to get to the end and we won't pay attention to what we're being asked to tick or untick, and we're less likely to sort of just do the action. That's an example of a nudge tactic. And here you could see, government love nudge tactics too, and they definitely have their place. And here you can see it being used in this slogan, which was seeming to tell us that if we stay at home, there's a result, we'll save lives. So that's fine. That bit's fine because that's within our realm of control. And then they added on protect the NHS, knowing that the NHS is something that we all really value. But the interesting thing was they were telling us to do this action that leads to protecting the NHS at the same time as they weren't doing the same thing. So at that very same time, they weren't providing adequate protective equipment for frontline workers or guidance to care workers, and doctors were feeling very unstable at that time. And I was a bit concerned about what this was going to do to us, because this is a big responsibility to hand us. Actually protecting the NHS at a time of catastrophe is government's job. And really what they should have been doing, instead of trying to use those nudge tactics which rely on normality, that gives, in this scenario, they kind of give us an action to do and a reason to do the action. You can see, what I've just explained explains why that wasn't appropriate in this situation. What happened in this situation was there was no normality. Normality had been removed. We were in a pandemic and we were concerned about our very basic survival. Our way of living had just entirely changed. We were being asked to stay home when we normally busy ourselves going to and from work. We were being asked not to see anyone outside our family bubble, when actually our whole economy relies on going out and consuming in big groups of people. And we were being asked not to consume anymore as well, right? So we can order things in, but actually the sorts of things we do socially rely on consumption, that was stopping. So what do we do with our lives now? We're in this big question mark. And so the type of communication you need to bring in at that point is more, you really need some very strong leadership communication that looks at us as holistic beings, that understands what emotional state we've just been put in, and what we look to leaders when safety is removed, when we're in a time of danger. We look for leadership, and what we were getting was a slogan that wasn't being practiced by the leaders. And a good example of where this leadership communication did happen was in New Zealand. We've seen this being pointed to a lot with Jacinda Ardern. And there was a really good article written on this, actually, and I'll try and put it in the comments by a communication psychologist. And she said, the reason Jacinda Ardern was so successful is because she had these kind of 3 principles that always work in leadership communication. One was empathy. So she spoke about the emotional state of people first. And then the other was, she sort of, and I'm not quoting verbatim here, but she's role modeling. So she is doing the thing. She was doing her briefings from home. She was showing how this was impacting her as a mother from her home. And then she gave directions. So people could kind of now, they had a new context. They could make meaning out of what's happening, what this new world is. And then she was given them, so she's given them like, this is your new normal. Let me describe it to you. This is how it's going to affect you. This is how you must be feeling. So now we're ready to listen, and we're tuned in, and we kind of have an idea of what's happening. And then we still don't know how to act in this world. And then she comes in with so here's how you must act. Do not leave your home. Do not, if you do leave your home, it's just to go shopping. When you do go shopping, wear a mask. It was very clear and consistent. Whereas in this country, our communication also, what backed up that slogan was not very strong. We saw people not doing what the slogan said, as in the Dominic Cummings scenario. Which makes us think, well, if the leaders are doing it and they have the most information, they know the most about the new normal. They're like the captains of the ship. They know exactly how long it's going to take us to sink and exactly where we need to go to survive. So if they're not going to the lifeboat straight away, we don't need to go to the lifeboat straight away. And that it's sort of those more subtle forms of communication beyond the slogan that our government hadn't quite nailed. And so we weren't seeing the role modeling, and we didn't see empathy for a very long time. It's only really starting to come through now. We didn't see context giving. So what we did get, just to summarise, is what we did get is we got given a massive responsibility, save the NHS, without being given really the means to look after ourselves or a clear idea of what we needed to do to survive.
Myra, how does this affect individuals? They're being kind of given these confusing communications and at the same time being handed over such a huge responsibility when we're going through such a big change. How does that affect a person?
Well, I'll come back then to that kind of hot potato metaphor that you mentioned earlier. To kind of put it really side by side with what Anna has just said, that if we think of that hot potato as the responsibility being chucked at communities and individuals from government, and so communities and individuals general public ends up holding that hot potato as something really weighty, something really heavy, and something literally almost too hot to handle. Like the pressure of it actually feels quite overwhelming. And just as Anna was describing it, I could feel within myself even kind of a reaction to it, which was, gosh, that feels really anxious. So there is this separation between government and then the general public. And in that division, it then becomes about a general public and communities and individuals taking responsibility to absolutely, protect the NHS and to save the NHS, with there being no real effective communication or leadership around what, as communities or individuals, what they or we can do to also protect ourselves as well. So there's something around a real spotlight being put on the NHS, but a spotlight in which almost the government have gone, right, we've pointed it out to you. Now can you guys, you the general public, can you now take over? And that's what I refer to as this hot potato, that it's being chucked at us. And with such force as well, and I think that goes back to Anna's point about the nudge tactic, it's thrown at us with such force, a bit like a tennis ball being hurled at us at 100 miles an hour, that the force in which it's thrown at us, that we have to catch that, and we kind of almost stumble backwards in how do we manage holding this, but at the same time, without our normality, without our safety and security of our everyday and the normality and our daily habits that we had before. So it's holding a hot potato whilst being on shaky ground, or think of it being on, a high wire whilst trying to juggle 10 hot potatoes. I mean, it's just impossible, but that's essentially the metaphor, the scenario we've ended up in.
Anita, as Myra explained, this is putting a huge responsibility on communities too. How might that affect kind of inter-community relationships?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one, because I think, what we're also seeing, kind of bouncing off what Myra said, is there's this kind of, there's this interesting phrase that keeps coming up, which is, in response to, for example, Dominic Cummings, there was that use your common sense. And actually some of the directions are not clear, are they? So some of them are, we want to stimulate the economy, go back to work if you can, but if you can work from home, do. And that itself is confusing. And that it's been quite interesting just seeing as well with this sort of evolution of local lockdowns, that a lot of those have happened in high ethnic minority areas. And some of the assumptions that we've started to hear around why that might be. So some of them are fair, they're around language and not being able to necessarily engage with the rules. And I think that makes sense, because the communications are confusing to English first language speakers. So how much more confusing if that's not your first language? But I also think there's some unfairness in there around sort of judgments about behaviour, because I think, we sort of, there's almost a hierarchy in common sense is really common. And I think that could be a recipe for division as well. I really do think we still need very clear communications that are universal. The common sense thing, I think, is a recipe for division.
The one thing I want to add to what you've just said, Anna, around, because it links back into this kind of hot potato metaphor, which is just as the hot potato was kind of chucked to all communities to hold the responsibility, now when we're looking at the othering through blame and shame of, well, it's other communities that are now responsible for new spikes or rises, or why the overall rate isn't going down perhaps, or not as quickly as expected. That again is kind of the ripple effect of when hot potatoes exist, because the moment they're all chucked to all communities, what do communities do? Try and then chuck them at other people. It's a bit like saying, we don't want the rubbish in our back garden, so I'll chuck it over the fence and put it in my neighbour's garden. And so that's literally what's happening in terms of now the blaming of why we're seeing perhaps spikes or rises in particular communities, or why the rate isn't going down as quickly. So I think there's also something around when it's being thrown at us to hold and to do our bit. I think there's a real urgency then for people to want to kind of get rid of that responsibility as well. And I think it's an awareness of where and when is that been done? And as you've outlined, Anna, there are times when that's done and it's acceptable to do. And I think when it's come about the difference between ethnic communities, that's where it's being done. And in some parts, people have felt that that's kind of almost been acceptable. Whereas then the moment we then see large gatherings in pubs or on a Friday night out or at beaches, somehow we don't look at those gatherings as appropriate or acceptable places to then go, well, hold on a minute, there's no social distancing happening there. So I think there's something about particular communities, and I think particular contexts of large gatherings or social distancing gatherings, we're being subjective about which ones then are acceptable to kind of frown upon, but also which ones are a definite no-go.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And also I think it comes out in terms of sort of celebrations and remembrance as well, doesn't it? So we saw, for example, that coming out for VE Day, that was fine, and that was in the strictest parts of lockdown. But socially distanced Eid gatherings, for example, or Ramadan, everyone was very concerned about Ramadan, and Ramadan got its own messaging. And actually, I think Muslim communities did very well to stay socially distanced in such a social month. And I think I remember that sort of, probably to say mildly upsetting some people, that then we have VE Day where, well, that celebration's okay. And also, again, it comes back to that, how are you communicating the rules? Are you leading by example? Are you doing what you're asking people to do? And we're just not seeing that. So,
I was just going to say that, it goes back to that phrase of actions speak louder than words. And so what you just said, Anna, in terms of, well, government are telling us, so through words, they're telling us what to do, but their actions don't match. And I think it's their actions that have then spoken louder than words. The number of times that Boris Johnson has been kind of pulled up on, or it's been signified when he hasn't worn a mask. Obviously, everyone's heard about then Dominic Cummings and his drive up to Barnard Castle. So there's something around actions absolutely have spoken louder than words. But also, just quickly going back to this idea about common sense, I think it's being used politically in a way, because there's something about, again, all diverse communities are being told to use your common sense, of which, and again, that's the hot potato right there. We're throwing it to you to use your common sense. I think it's being used as almost to weaponize society then to vilify certain communities. And actually that brings us full circle back to your original point, Anna, which was, we're being thrown these hot potatoes in a time when our norm, our everyday has gone. And so this idea of please use your common sense, there's something a bit like, well, use your common sense in a war zone, use your common sense while we're in blackout, use your common sense whilst we're in lockdown. And it's a bit like, use your common sense in a context that the norm doesn't exist. So even just to say use common sense, it's like, well, you're asking us to apply logic and reasoning at a time where we don't know the variables. It's the equivalent of saying, please use your common sense to cross the road. And in normal everyday life, we'll go, well, we'll just wait for the green man. To go with that metaphor then, we're being told, please use your common sense to cross a motorway in which cars are coming in both directions, they're coming at full speed and there are no traffic lights. But please do use your common sense. And so it's a bit like, please apply your logic and reasoning to a context and to a situation which is unfamiliar to us.
I'm just going to put the juxtaposition there as well, that's being asked of us, that hot potato is being thrown at the same time as we've heard government ministers kind of not accepting responsibility for the lack of PPE or for having locked us down on time. So, I mean, the famous, Home Secretary's comment when she was challenged about the lack of PPE, and she said, "I'm sorry you feel that way." And it was sort of like, I'm not taking responsibility for what is fairly my responsibility. Here you go. And so what do we do? And what we've seen is, again, we sort of take that and we're like, uncertain times. It's there, you know, I don't know what to do with this. As to your analogy, Myra, I'm in the middle of the like oncoming traffic. I'm going to throw this at someone else, and that came through really strongly in the comments. You know, that actually there was such high levels of suspicion of other people. So when we asked people whether they're keeping to the rules, most people said they were, but when we asked the locals keeping to the rules, most people also said locals aren't keeping to the rules, and almost half of people wanted to remind other people of the rules. So there was this real, like, what we saw was a real like desire to control what other people are doing, to try and control this situation where everything's just a bit crazy, but with no kind of, it almost felt like almost, you know, the desire for control was out of proportion, and that tells me that that's because we haven't given people enough of the context and the tools to get through it. And it kind of goes back to Malika Speak's question, you know, about how's this affecting communities. What we also saw in the qualitative comments was people blaming selfish members of the public, certain communities, really kind of deflecting where the blame lay for the spread of the virus. You know, we saw a lot of that throwing of hot potatoes coming out there.
Well, that's the parallel right there between certain communities blaming other communities and not taking responsibility themselves, and then the Home Secretary and the government doing exactly the same thing. So this is where actions speak louder than words. If the government have essentially washed, excuse the pun, but washed their hands of it, then certain communities are doing the same and going, right, we're going to wash our hands of this responsibility as well, and it's these other communities. So just as the Home Secretary has gone, oh, well, I'm sorry you feel that way, as if it's not my responsibility to make sure that all NHS workers have got access to PPE. Certain communities, or as you said, within a local community, certain people within a local community have gone, well, it's not me, it's these other people.
Yeah.
Because no one wants to take responsibility for it, and not even responsibility. What feels like they don't take responsibility for it, because it feels as if they're taking responsibility for everybody. And I think that's again reflected in people locally reminding other people of the rules, because again, when we're in lockdown, we're not able to perhaps show or be influential at a wider circle. We can only be influential within our immediate circle or bubble or local community. And so it's almost a bit like with government actually telling us to each of you play your part, there then is that kind of reinforcement of, well, if you see somebody, you know, essentially it's like local policing. And we've been handed that by this hot potato to go, can you not only make sure that you're respecting the lockdown restrictions, but can you make sure then that everyone else around you is as well? And of course, again, that local evidence, you know, seeing other people, whether they flout the rules or whether they adhere to the rules, is for a lot of us our only first-hand experience of actually the outside world. And that's our only way of knowing, are other people actually abiding by this lockdown or not? And so when we see people that are not, I can understand why people feel then they need to go and remind them, because they've been handed the power through this hot potato.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make, and probably important to note for the podcast that we did see a kind of an ethnic lens to that passing on of responsibility as well. So where the majority ethnic population were most likely to want to remind others of the rules, the minority ethnic populations we surveyed were most likely to have been reminded of the rules. And in the qualitative comments as well, when we asked people what's been their experience of the rules, it was mostly again from the majority ethnic population, where this hot potato of blame was kind of being put on just general members of the public. Mostly, I keep referring to them as the stupid idiots, because that was the phrase that came up most often. Stupid idiots not keeping to the rules, stupid idiots touching everything in the supermarket, and stupid idiots walking too close to me. So that was sort of like the blaming actually happened amongst the majority ethnic population. It was not explicitly racialized in the language they used necessarily. There were some instances of that, The majority, though, was just seeing other people as a threat. So, you know, we can really see that hot potato was being tossed around with, as you say, quite some force, because those comments made up a large number of the overall comments in the majority ethnic group. In the minority ethnic groups, interestingly, the blame was being sent back to government. So that was quite interesting. So majority ethnic group also kind of spoke about the government not keeping to the rules and Dominic coming. So this came out in all groups, but it was interesting that in the minority ethnic groups, we really didn't see, I don't think, maybe we had one comment, but we really didn't see many or any comments that were talking about stupid members of the public. So that was quite interesting to observe as well. And I wonder whether it feeds into our idea of common sense not being that common, as we know.
I think that, you know, that really leads into the question, or a question that I think is important, is how do we now deal with this as communities? Or to bring it back to the metaphor, how do we cool down the oven?
I love the use of this metaphor, because I think it helps us to understand actually kind of the oven that we're in, and actually it's that awareness of actually how hot it is. And I think for a lot of us, it is about understanding then and actually being consciously aware of, oh, it's a hot potato that's being chucked at me, or I myself have been placed in this hot oven as the primary person or community to hold responsibility to kind of solve the problem of COVID. And so I think awareness is a huge part in terms of a starting point and a stepping stone then into what can we then do about it to cool the oven down. I think the first thing is to acknowledge and recognise and identify that I'm actually in the oven in the first place. And we can do that through conversation, we can do that through reflective spaces, and actually it's about actually bringing the community together to actually create socially distanced and of course safe spaces, but spaces in which people can come and say, actually, this has been my experience during lockdown. Because again, we're very aware that there has been such a spectrum, such a vast range and breadth of people's experiences of lockdown itself as well. And it's about acknowledging that for some people, it's actually had a very positive effect on them, and they've been able to, make advantage, take advantage of the situation in particular areas of their life. But for vast majorities of communities, because of their social, economic, political context, that for them the lockdown has been an incredibly negative and devaluing and incredibly difficult and challenging time for them. So I think there's something first of all about how have I felt, and then it's about actually together, how do we foster those connections and communications and conversations for us to start talking about the differences in our experiences as well. Because again, I think there's something about another kind of, if I can still use that metaphor, I think another hot potato that's been thrown our way is the message of how to actually experience lockdown itself, that somehow we're being told the message of see it as a positive. Spend this time now when you're not working to write the book you've always wanted to, or learn the second language that you don't know, or learn a musical instrument. And it's like, no, hold on a minute. That's only available as an option to people who are in a place of safety and security in which a time of growth is open to them. For a lot of people, it hasn't been a time of thriving. For a lot of people, it's been a time of surviving. And I think if we can acknowledge that in safe spaces, first of all, it allows each of us to recognise then, actually, that has been my experience. So absolutely, community spaces for us to be open enough to actually acknowledge, identify what our experience has been, how I have been feeling, and where that also, most importantly, has left me as lockdown starts to get lifted and restrictions start to get lifted. We need to recognise, actually, what have I just gone through? We've all gone through, in inverted commas here, an experience, but that experience has been different for each and every one of us. And I think we need to actually offer ourselves time actually process, actually, what's just happened? What have I just gone through? And let's not forget that for a lot of families and a lot of communities coming out of lockdown and, you know, life post-lockdown, there is going to be a huge amount of grief and loss that people are going to be holding and suffering from all those people that have passed away. And I think, again, government has not helped that situation by, in a way, just it being a statistic and it just being a number. Because I think that in itself dehumanises the people that have passed away. And I think it absolutely devalues, diminishes and dismisses the grief that families are going through. And for some families, they will have experienced multiple bereavements. So again, space and time for the healing of all of that trauma as well.
What's important from this discussion is the recognition that government communications are placing a greater sense of division on inter-community relationships. In order to cool down the oven, we need acceptance and awareness through reflective spaces, as well as empowering ourselves and others. By doing this, not only are we healing ourselves, but we're also creating a greater sense of community and togetherness. If you have any questions or thoughts, please do leave them in the comments. Thank you for joining our discussions at the Coping Mechanism, and we look forward to welcoming you next time.